The recent Supreme Court oral arguments in the consolidated case of Learning Resources, Inc. et al. v. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States et al. Focused on a monumental legal question: whether the President is lawfully authorized by the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to levy broad, unilateral tariffs. These tariffs, imposed by the executive branch under the declaration of various national emergencies, including trade deficits, challenge the traditional constitutional boundaries separating presidential emergency power from Congress's exclusive power to tax. The nearly 3-hour argument revealed deep skepticism from the bench, particularly among justices concerned with the expansion of executive authority. The tax versus regulation constitutional fault line. The central legal debate hinged on the interpretation of IEEPA's statutory language, which grants the President authority to regulate importation of property during a declared emergency, but conspicuously omits any mention of the words tariff or tax. Solicitor General D. John Sauer, arguing for the federal parties, maintained that the tariffs are purely regulatory tools aimed at addressing foreign policy and economic threats, and not revenue-raising taxes. Sauer framed the massive revenue generated, reported by Customs and Border Protection to be over $89 billion collected through August 31, as merely incidental to the regulatory goals. He argued that the power to regulate commerce has historically included the power to impose tariffs. However, this distinction was met with sharp pushback. Justice Elena Kagan and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson repeatedly questioned how a measure that deposits billions of dollars into the U.S. Treasury, bypassing the typical legislative process, could be considered anything other than a tax, a power explicitly reserved for Congress under Article 1 of the Constitution. Neil Gorsuch, representing the challenging businesses, hammered this point, stating plainly that tariffs are taxes. They take dollars from Americans' pockets and deposit them in the U.S. Treasury. Our founders gave that taxing power to Congress alone. Chief Justice John Roberts further complicated the government's position by asking who ultimately pays the cost, forcing Sauer to concede that American consumers and importers absorb anywhere from 30% to 80% of the burden. The Major Questions Doctrine and Delegation. A second critical line of challenge involved the Major Questions Doctrine, MQD, which holds that if the executive branch claims authority under a statute to carry out a policy with profound economic or political consequences, Congress must have delegated that authority explicitly. Challengers argued that the President's actions fit the MQD criteria perfectly. The imposition of IEEPA tariffs has been a policy of deep economic and political significance, raising the average effective U.S. stock tariff rate from a historical baseline of approximately 2.3% to an estimated 13% to 27% in 2025, an average rate not seen since before World War II. Justices Neil Gorsuch, Clarence Thomas, and Chief Justice Roberts all returned to this doctrine, expressing concern over the sweeping scope of the power claimed. Justice Gorsuch postulated that if the government's logic holds, a future administration could declare a climate change emergency and impose taxes under IEEPA, a consequence the Solicitor General admitted was possible. Conversely, the government argued that the MQD should not apply to matters of foreign policy and national security, fields where the President is traditionally granted significant latitude. Yet, given the tariff's clear and massive domestic economic impact, the court seemed to view the case as a fundamental separation of powers issue, requiring explicit congressional authorization. The financial and economic stakes. The arguments were grounded in the sheer scale of the financial policy at issue. The economic projections cited by both sides highlighted the magnitude of the case. Tariff revenue. The federal government projected that the IEEPA tariffs would raise an additional $1.8 to $2.4 trillion over the next decade. Economic impact. Economic analyses submitted by the challengers and organizations like the Tax Foundation suggested the tariff regime would reduce long-run U.S. gross domestic product, GDP, by approximately 0.6 to 0.8% and could cost the economy hundreds of thousands of jobs. Refund liability. If the Supreme Court rules against the President, the government may be required to refund an estimated $130 billion in duties collected since the tariffs were imposed, an unprecedented fiscal liability. Business impact. Importers cited devastating direct costs. The petitioner, Learning Resources, claimed the tariffs would cost the company $100 million in a single year, compared to just a fraction of that previously. These figures underlined the core tension. The claimed regulation is functionally a large-scale tax policy with profound, measurable effects on the nation's economy. The court's decision will determine not only the fate of the current tariff regime, but also the constitutional limits of executive power in times of declared emergency. The ruling is poised to be a landmark precedent on the balance between Article 1, Congress's power to tax, and Article 2, the executive's foreign policy powers.